Hey guys, welcome back to Suburban Ranch. So in today's video, we're gonna focus on removing the transmission from our 1990 GMC K1500. We recently replaced the pan gasket, but it's still leaking. It looks like the leak is now coming from the front seal of the transmission, which means it needs to come out. All right, so here we are under the truck. And if you look at the inspection cover here, it's probably a little bit hard to see on video, but I'll just wipe it with a clean paper towel. It's still kind of hard to see. But basically the transmission fluid is dripping down off of this inspection cover. So that indicates a leak from the front of the transmission. I'm thinking it's probably a front seal, but we really won't know until we get the transmission out. So, first steps in removing the transmission. One, drain all the fluids. So we have videos on how to drain both the transfer case and the transmission. We'll link both of those videos below. Once you have everything drained, the next step is to remove the exhaust. So we'll start here with the Y pipe. So we'll remove these 3 bolts that hold the Y pipe to the manifold, do the same on the other side, and we should be able to slide this Y pipe out of the way. So we've got the Y pipe disconnected from the manifold on both sides. Next up, we'll disconnect the Y pipe from the catalytic converter. So if you watch our exhaust video, you'll see that we use these lap joint bands rather than the typical U-bolts to connect the exhaust together. I really like these because if you need to come back and do some work later on, just like what we're doing now, you will be able to get the exhaust apart. So you can see how loose the exhaust is now. Basically, it doesn't dent the 2 pipes together, which makes it nearly impossible to get them apart like a U-bolt does. So there we go, Y pipe's off. Next up, we're going to remove the inspection cover. There are 2 braces that run from the inspection cover up to the engine mount area. We've already removed those 2 braces because we also replaced the oil pan gasket and we have not put them back yet. So if you are doing this from scratch, you'll have to remove those 2 braces as well. And then there are also 6 total bolts, so 3 on each side, holding the inspection cover on. 15mm socket will do the trick. So there we go, inspection cover's off. Now that we've got the inspection cover off, we can remove the 3 bolts that hold the flex plate to the torque converter. And these bolts are 15mm. So I'll put an end wrench on here. There's not a ton of room to work with. And I'll just try to tap it with a hammer and see if we can break them loose. There we go. So there we go. There's one of the bolts. So to reach the other 2 bolts, we actually need to turn the motor over. So we will put a breaker bar on the front crank pulley bolt and rotate the motor over until we get another torque converter bolt here down at the bottom, and we'll remove the next bolt. So we'll go ahead and loosen the second bolt here. And we stopped it in a more convenient place where we can actually get a ratchet on it now too. Second bolt's out. There we go. Here we are on the driver's side of the transmission. We're gonna Start out by disconnecting the shift linkage. There's a little clip right here we'll need to pull up. There we go, we've got it disconnected off the transmission. We've got a plug here as well. There we go. And there's a small 8mm bolt holding on a wire loom. So we'll loosen that as well. So there we go. Got that wire loom loose. So we'll work our way back. There's a vent hose and a couple more plugs in the transfer case on the driver's side here. So looking at the other end of the shift linkage here, there's another clip that I'm going to pull out. And that should allow us to disconnect the shift linkage coming from the steering column. And with that disconnected, I should be able to pull the shift linkage out of the frame here that goes over to the transmission. So there we go. And now we have plenty more space on the driver's side when we do go to pull the transmission out. Here we are, still on the driver's side of the truck, but back on the transfer case. There is another shift linkage here that I disconnected just by prying out on it with a flat screwdriver. It looks kind of like an exhaust hanger, so you have to pull it through that rubber isolator. So we'll set that out of the way. Just right there at the end of my finger is another plug that I disconnected. And then there's also a vent hose right here on the transfer case that was also disconnected. So there's a look at the transfer case and all the things we disconnected on the driver's side. Here we are at the back of the transfer case. One additional plug that needs disconnected. So there's little tabs on both sides that you just pry up on and you can pull it straight out. Now, one thing I should mention now that we're back here is that we actually have removed both the front and rear drive shaft prior to starting this transmission removal. The front and rear drive shafts are actually up at a shop right now getting new U-joints put in, but it is pretty straightforward to pull those front and rear drive shafts. Basically, you just unbolt the U-joints, so at the rear and front differentials. The rear drive shaft just is a slip yoke, so it just slides right off of the spline shaft here. And the front drive shaft, there's 4 bolts that hold it on. So pretty straightforward process to remove. Here we are on the passenger side of the truck. We've disconnected a few things on the transmission here. So we've got our TV cable. And so this TV cable connects to this TV link. So I'm just holding it up with a screwdriver. So it's a little link that sticks out of the transmission itself. We also disconnected both of the transmission cooler lines, so I just used a 1/2-inch flare nut wrench to disconnect those two. So the only thing we have left on the transmission at this point, we're going to disconnect the starter, and we still have the dipstick, but the dipstick's being held in with a bracket with one of the bell housing bolts, so we'll hold off on disconnecting that dipstick for the moment. Here we are back at the front of the truck. When we were removing these torque converter bolts, I forgot to mention that we need to place a mark to mark the orientation of that torque converter to the flex plate. Next up, we're going to remove the starter. So this is held in with 2 9/16 bolts. And we do have the battery disconnected as well. So when removing a starter, it's really handy to have a third arm to hold it up while you remove the wires off of the front of the solenoid. The larger bolt on the front of the starter is a 5/8. Go ahead and loosen that up. And then the smaller bolt looks like it's a 9mm. Okay, now we should be able to drop the starter right out. Next up, we're going to loosen the bolts that hold the transmission cross member on. So they're 18 millimeter, and there is a nut on the top. Next up, we'll spin off the two nuts on the bottom of the transmission cross member that hold the transmission mount in place. And we've got two bolts that go from the transmission mount up into the transmission casting itself, also 15 millimeter. We'll go ahead and take those out as well. So at this point, we're ready to jack up the transmission, and we should be able to pull this transmission mount out and the transmission cross member as well. We've got our transmission jack placed under the transmission. We've lifted it, just about a ½ inch, so you should see a gap here just between the transmission mount and the transmission case itself. So since we've taken all the bolts off of the transmission mount, we can remove that now. And we've got all the bolts out of this cross member, so we should be able to get the cross member out of the way as well. So there we go, cross member's out of the way. Okay, so with the cross member out, we've got a lot more space in here to remove the bolts that hold the transmission to the transfer case itself. So there's 6 bolts here. They're 14 millimeters in size. I've got a bridge jack positioned under the transfer case as well to support it. So I'll go ahead and remove these 6 bolts. Okay, so it's time to start removing the bell housing bolts. So here we are on the passenger side of the truck, and this is the top bell housing bolt. You can get at this with a 14 millimeter socket, a U-joint, and I'm using 26 inches of extensions to get the ratchet back behind the transmission. So I've already broke it loose, and we'll go ahead and back it out now. So that bolts out, and you can also see the bracket there. So that's the bracket that holds the transmission fluid dipstick on. So now that we have that bolt out, we should be able to pull the dipstick out. With the bracket detached, I've got somebody up under the hood, and they should be able to just pull that transmission dipstick tube straight up. Oh yeah. All right, there we go. Dipstick tube is removed. So we're still over on the passenger side. We have to remove the 5 remaining bell housing bolts. So we're going to start with the lower bell housing bolt here at the center of the screen. This is a stud and nut combo. So we'll go ahead and remove this nut, and then we can remove that bracket, and there'll be another nut below it. So the first nut is a 13 millimeter. So again, we're using a 20-inch extension and a U-joint here. Okay, so there's the first nut. We'll move up and do the bell housing bolt above next. So there is another bell housing bolt just right there, and then we'll be able to pull both of those brackets off. We've got a 13 millimeter socket on that top nut, and we're using 26 inches of total extension. That seems to actually work a little bit better than just the 20-inch extension that we used on the bottom nut. It's able to get you back behind the transmission and you're able to swing the ratchet a lot better. So we'll go ahead and spin this one off. All right, so I rotated the heat shield out of the way and we've exposed the two 14mm nuts. So we've got a 14mm socket on the top nut and we'll go ahead and back that out. All right, we'll just undo that top one by hand. And that'll be all of the bolts on the passenger side of the truck. So we'll move over to the driver's side next. All right, so here we are over on the driver's side. So we can see the two bottom bolts, and we'll go ahead and do the bottom one first. So again, that's gonna be a 14mm, and we'll use the 26 inches of extension. Okay, and with that bolt out, we'll move up to the next bolt. And so we've got a 13mm nut to run off first, and then we'll remove that bracket, and then we'll take the 14mm bolt out. There we go. We've got one more bolt up towards the top here on the driver's side, and then we should have all the bell housing bolts out. All right, so to get the last bell housing bolt on the driver's side, I've taken my U-joint and just wrapped a little bit of masking tape around it, and that just provides a little more rigidity to that joint because we've got to reach all the way up to the top of the transmission here. We're going to zoom in the video and you should be able to just barely see the nut that we're going after. So again, this time it's actually a little bit bigger. It's a 14mm nut holding on the fuel line brackets. So once we remove that nut, we'll then be able to remove the bell housing bolt. So I'll feed this extension up there and see if we can spin it out. We did go up on top and remove the fuel lines from the throttle body to give ourselves enough slack in those fuel lines to pull that bracket around the stud on this bolt that we're removing on the top. So I fed our 14mm socket back up to the top using the same masking tape trick. And now we're going to go ahead and unthread it. I already broke it loose. I believe it's threaded all the way out. Just need to reach up there and see if I can pop that stud out. There we go. Okay, so that should have been the last bell housing bolt. So we have all of the bell housing bolts out. I've went around and zip tied up the shift linkage and all of the wire harness. I've also run a safety chain around the top of the transmission and attached it to our transmission jack, and ran a ratchet strap below the engine oil pan to support the rear of the engine after we pull the transmission out. So the next step is really to try to slide the transmission off of the engine block. There are still two dowel pins, so one on each side, that are mating that transmission and engine together. So it's probably going to take a little bit of wiggling and finagling back and forth to get this transmission out. But there should be nothing holding it in place anymore. So the transmission is out. We've got it lowered on the transmission jack here. So the next step is to lift it off the jack and get it out from under the truck, and we'll show you guys what it looks like out of the truck. Here's a look at everything out of the truck. So we've got the transmission. So this is a 1990 model, which means it's a 700R4 transmission, and the transfer case, which is a 2-speed new process 241 transfer case. Next step is to haul both of these pieces over to our local transmission shop, have the transmission rebuilt, and I'm gonna get a new torque converter as well, and have the transfer case resealed. So stay tuned for the next steps on this project.